Ethan was awake again. The light above him flickered, casting a dull glow across the sterile, silver walls. He felt the coldness of the medical bed beneath him, but the pain from the injuries he'd sustained on his mission was the sharpest thing in his mind. His head throbbed and his chest ached, the bandages wrapped around it soaked in a mix of blood and the antiseptic they had used to clean his wounds. The mission had gone wrong, nothing new for an explorer, but this time it felt different. His survival now depended on someone or something he didn't understand. He had woken up in an alien medical facility on a planet far from Earth, his body patched up but still very much broken. The place was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The walls shimmered with a strange, smooth texture, and the air was thick with the hum of machines that seemed to breathe and pulse with a life of their own. He couldn't make out the symbols on the walls. They were foreign to him, as everything else in this place was. A door slid open with a soft swish, and a figure entered the room. Ethan blinked, trying to focus his blurry vision. She wasn't like any alien he had seen before, and he had seen his fair share. Tall, slender, and graceful, she moved with a quiet elegance, her blue skin shimmering faintly under the lights. Her eyes, large and a deep shade of violet, studied him as she approached. Her features were soft yet striking, with delicate ridges running down her cheekbones, giving her a look of ancient wisdom. She wasn't intimidating in the way most alien species were. No, her presence was calm, almost soothing. "You're awake," she said, her voice soft but clear, carrying an almost melodic quality. Ethan tried to speak, but his throat was dry, a scratchy sensation making it hard to form words. He cleared his throat, winced, and managed a weak nod. He looked around the room again, taking in the unfamiliar sight. "What happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Where am I?" "You're in the medical facility of the Zoritha. This is our planet Vornax," she replied, stepping closer. "You've been injured quite badly." Ethan's mind scrambled for understanding. Vornax. He had heard the name mentioned briefly in the context of intergalactic peace talks, but he had no idea he would end up here, let alone injured in such a strange place. The memories of his mission flooded back, the sudden attack, the explosion, the crash landing. He had thought he was going to die. The nurse moved to the side of his bed, her long fingers reaching for the medical instruments on the nearby table. She picked up a glowing device that seemed to hum with energy and began to hover it over his chest. Ethan instinctively flinched, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. "Don't worry, this will help," she reassured him, her tone gentle. "We've already treated most of your wounds, but we need to monitor your chest area. You took a serious blow there." Ethan glanced down at his chest, the bandages wrapped tightly around it. He didn't know much about alien medical procedures, but he could feel that there was something about his injury that made the nurse uneasy. He had been through a lot before. He had been hurt many times, but this felt different. Her touch lingered, and he couldn't help but notice the way her eyes studied him. For a moment, there was silence. The soft buzzing of the medical device filled the room as she moved it over his chest, scanning for any irregularities. Ethan could feel the warmth of her touch through the fabric of his bandages. There was something oddly comforting about her presence, something that made him feel safe in the most unfamiliar place he had ever been. Then, she froze. The device hovered a few inches above his chest, its light flickering strangely. Ethan noticed her hand trembling slightly as she held the device. Her expression shifted from calm to something else, curiosity, perhaps, or even confusion. She leaned in closer, her violet eyes focused on the screen of the device, and then slowly, almost in disbelief, she whispered to herself, "It's impossible." Ethan was startled. He looked up at her, confused. "What's impossible?" She blinked and turned her gaze to him, her face momentarily softening. I'm sorry, it's just..." She hesitated as though unsure of what to say next. "What you're showing, it's not like anything I've seen before, not in any human." Ethan frowned, confused and a little worried. "What do you mean? Is something wrong with me?" Zura, the nurse, paused, taking a deep breath. She set the device down gently on the table and looked at him, her expression serious. "I need to run a few more tests. What you're showing, it's not just biological, it's something else. Something unique." Ethan didn't know what to make of it. He could feel his heart rate increase slightly as a sense of unease began to settle in his stomach. What was so strange about him? He was just a man, a human, nothing more, nothing less, but the way she looked at him made him feel like he was somehow different. Was it just his injury, or was there something deeper that Zura was picking up on? "Just tell me." Ethan said, his voice shaky but determined. What's wrong with me? Zura looked at him for a moment, studying his face. Then she seemed to make up her mind. She stepped back, collecting herself before responding. It's nothing physical. Your body is healing well and you're stable. But, she added, her voice lowering to a whisper, your chest. It contains something your species shouldn't have. Ethan's brow furrowed. What do you mean by that? What do I have? Zura's eyes met his with a mix of caution and fascination. I don't know how to explain it yet. But you are different. Humans shouldn't possess this trait. It's something that shouldn't exist in your biology. Her words were filled with a kind of awe, and Ethan could feel her growing curiosity. Before he could ask more questions, the door to the room slid open again and two other figures entered. They were taller than Zura, their bodies encased in metallic suits. One of them, a male, nodded at Zura, acknowledging her presence. Is he awake? The man asked, his voice deep and emotionless. Ethan turned his attention to the two newcomers, but Zura quickly stepped between them and him. He's still recovering, she said firmly. No one will disturb him yet. The male alien narrowed his eyes but said nothing. He turned to Zura, his voice cold. We need him, now. Ethan didn't understand what was happening, but he could sense the tension rising. Who were these people? Why did they seem so interested in him? And what was so special about his chest? Zura seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. She turned to Ethan, a quiet urgency in her eyes. I'm sorry, you're not safe here anymore, but I will help you. Ethan nodded, still processing everything. He didn't know what was going on, but he knew one thing. This was far from over. Whatever was inside him, whatever Zura had seen, it had just changed everything. And he had a feeling it wasn't just his life that was in danger now. He was going to need answers. Ethan felt his heart racing as he lay there, trying to make sense of the strange situation. Zura, the alien nurse, had told him that something in his body, something hidden deep inside, was unlike anything they had ever seen. She had whispered about his chest, about his unique trait, but he didn't understand. All he knew was that he was no longer alone in the quiet, sterile room. Now there were more people, aliens, he assumed, watching him closely, waiting for something. He didn't know how long he had been in the medical facility, but he was beginning to feel the weight of his situation. His body was still sore from the injuries he had sustained during the mission, but it wasn't the physical pain that worried him now. No, it was the unknown. The feeling that something about him had changed, something that was far beyond his control, something that was connected to the aliens around him. Zura stood by the door, her posture tense. The two new figures who had entered were still watching him. One of them, an alien male, was staring at him with an unreadable expression. He had broad shoulders, and his suit shimmered in the light, almost metallic in appearance. The second alien, a female, stood slightly behind him, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the room as if she was taking in every detail. Ethan's mind raced. Who were these people? What did they want from him? Zura had said he wasn't safe, but she hadn't explained why. He wanted to ask her more questions, but she seemed focused on the two new arrivals. She wasn't making eye contact with him anymore, and he could sense that something was happening that was beyond his understanding. The male alien, who had spoken earlier, took a step forward. His voice was deep, commanding, but there was an edge of impatience in it as he addressed Zura. We need him now. The council will want to examine him immediately. He's an anomaly, something we've never seen before. Zura's eyes flicked toward the male alien, and for a moment Ethan thought he saw a flash of fear in her gaze. But it was gone quickly, replaced by a cool professionalism. He's not ready yet, Zura replied firmly. His injuries need more time to heal. And you still don't know what's inside him. I can't let you take him until we understand more. The male alien's eyes narrowed. We already know enough. There's no time to waste. The council has ordered it. The tension in the room thickened, and Ethan could feel his pulse quickening. The council. He didn't know what that meant, but he could guess it wasn't good. The council seemed to be in charge here, and if they wanted to take him, it was likely that whatever was in his chest, whatever made him different, was something valuable, something dangerous. Zura seemed to hesitate, her eyes flicking back and forth between the male alien and Ethan. Then, with a deep sigh, she spoke, her voice quieter this time. Please, give him more time, just a few more days. The male alien's gaze hardened. The council doesn't wait. You know that? Zura nodded slowly, her eyes falling to the floor for a brief moment. She seemed to be lost in thought, as if weighing something in her mind. After a few seconds, she straightened and turned to Ethan. "You need to get out of here," she said softly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "There's no time to explain, but they'll take you if they get the chance. You have to leave now while they're distracted." Ethan blinked, confused. "What do you mean? Where am I supposed to go? What's happening?" Zura didn't answer immediately. She glanced back at the two aliens who were still standing by the door, waiting for her to make a decision. Ethan could feel the pressure in the air, the sense that time was running out. Then Zura's eyes met his, and for the first time she seemed uncertain. "I'm sorry. I didn't want this to happen, but I don't have a choice. They'll find out everything if they keep you here. I can't let them do that." Ethan's head spun. He had no idea what Zura was talking about, but he could tell she was trying to help him, even if it meant putting herself at risk. The urgency in her voice, the way she looked at him, it was as if she saw something in him that terrified her. Something that could change everything. He wanted to ask more questions, to understand why they were treating him like this, but before he could speak, Zura was already moving. She moved quickly, her movements graceful and purposeful, heading toward a small control panel on the wall. She pressed a few buttons and the door to the room slid open. The two aliens by the door stiffened. "Zura, what are you doing?" the female alien asked sharply. Zura didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed Ethan by the arm and pulled him toward the door. "Come on, we don't have much time." Ethan didn't resist. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew that Zura was the only one who seemed to care about his safety. As they stepped out into the hallway, Ethan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The walls here were even more imposing than in the medical room, and the corridors stretched on for what felt like miles. He could hear distant voices, the sound of footsteps echoing, but everything seemed to blur together. He focused on Zura, who was moving with purpose, her eyes scanning the hallway as if she were looking for something or someone. "We need to go to the lower levels," Zura said, her voice low. "There's an escape route down there, but we have to be quick." Ethan didn't ask any more questions. He followed her, his mind racing. The air in the corridor was thick, and he could feel the tension building with every step they took. The sound of their footsteps seemed to echo in the silent halls, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They passed several doors along the way, most of them locked or sealed shut, but Zura didn't hesitate. She led him down a series of narrow, winding hallways, always moving with a sense of urgency. As they approached a large, metal door at the end of the corridor, Zura stopped and pressed a small button on the wall. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into the depths of the facility. "This way," Zura said, glancing over her shoulder at Ethan. Her eyes were filled with concern, but there was also something else there, something he couldn't quite place. "Hurry!" Ethan followed her down the stairs, the air growing colder as they descended. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the faint glow from the ceiling lights seemed to make the whole place feel alien, almost otherworldly. He didn't know where they were going, but he trusted Zura. She had been the only one to show him any kindness since he arrived. After what felt like an eternity of walking down the endless stairs, they reached the bottom. The hallway was darker here, the air thick with the smell of something unfamiliar. Zura stopped in front of a large door, her fingers hovering over a keypad. She glanced at Ethan before typing in a code. "Don't make a sound," she whispered as the door clicked open. Ethan stepped into the room, his heart pounding in his chest. Zura followed him, closing the door behind them with a soft click. The room was small, dimly lit, and filled with various pieces of equipment and machinery. It looked like a storage room of some kind, but there was a door at the far end, a door that seemed to lead to the outside. Zura moved quickly, her eyes scanning the room before she headed straight for the door. "This is it," she said. "We're almost there, but you have to be ready. Once we leave this place, there's no going back." Ethan didn't have time to respond. Zura opened the door, and they stepped out into the unknown. Ethan could feel the cold, damp air of the underground room wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. The door they had just passed through shut behind him with a quiet thud, but the noise seemed to echo in his mind. His heart was pounding harder now, each beat a reminder of the uncertainty that surrounded him. What was going on? Why was Zura helping him? And what was it that made him so special, so different from every other human, according to her? Zura moved quickly ahead, her figure barely visible in the dim light, her violet eyes scanning the space with cautious precision. Ethan, still feeling the lingering effects of his injuries, struggled to keep up, but he didn't want to fall behind. The sense of urgency that had taken over Zura seemed to fuel him, and despite his weakness, he pushed forward. He had to trust her. She was the only one who had shown him any kindness, the only one who seemed to care. They walked through the narrow hallway, the walls damp and lined with strange, glowing symbols that seemed to shift and change as they passed. The air was thick with an unfamiliar scent, something sharp, metallic, and heavy. Ethan couldn't quite place it, but he could feel it pressing on his chest, adding to the weight in his stomach. "Where are we going?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet. Zura didn't look at him, her focus ahead as she moved swiftly. "We're almost there," she replied quietly, her voice tight with a sense of urgency. "We need to get to the transport bay. It's the only way out of here." Ethan tried to make sense of her words, but the more he thought about it, the more questions flooded his mind. Why was she so determined to help him escape? Why was she risking her own safety for a human, especially when the others seemed so intent on studying him? And what was it about his chest that had made them so interested in him? He was about to ask another question when he heard a noise behind him. His muscles tensed, and he instinctively reached for the weapon he knew wasn't there. The footsteps were soft but deliberate, echoing off the walls in the otherwise silent corridor. Zura stopped abruptly, holding her breath for a moment as she listened. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't sure if it was fear or adrenaline, but he knew they had to keep moving. They couldn't afford to be caught. "They're getting closer," Zura muttered, her voice low and strained. "We don't have much time." Without warning, she grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him into a nearby room, the door sliding closed behind them with a quiet hiss. The room was small, filled with crates and equipment that looked like they had been abandoned. It smelled like dust and metal, and the only light came from a flickering overhead bulb. Ethan's heart raced as he looked around, trying to catch his breath. Zura was already moving to the far side of the room, her hands working quickly as she opened a hidden panel in the wall. Her fingers flew across a set of controls, and Ethan watched as the panel slid open, revealing a narrow passage that led even deeper into the facility. "Follow me," Zura whispered urgently, motioning for him to come closer. Ethan didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, his eyes darting nervously toward the door they had just entered, half expecting someone to burst through it at any moment. But Zura seemed confident, and he knew she had a plan. He just had to trust her. The passage they entered was dark, barely lit by the faint glow of alien symbols along the walls. It was narrow, barely wide enough for both of them to walk side by side, but Zura moved with ease, as if she had memorized the path. Ethan, on the other hand, had to fight to keep his balance, his head still spinning from the injury. They walked for what felt like an eternity, their footsteps muffled by the thick air. Ethan couldn't help but wonder what kind of place this was, what kind of alien society Zura belonged to. The walls seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and there were moments when Ethan could swear he felt a subtle vibration beneath his feet. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. He could feel his body responding to the unfamiliar environment, a mix of fear, confusion, and curiosity. Finally, they reached the end of the passage. Zura stopped and pressed her hand against another control panel. This time, the wall in front of them slid open to reveal a small, dimly lit room. Inside, there was a single seat and a console covered in strange symbols. "This is it," Zura said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is the only way out." Ethan felt a sense of disbelief. He had imagined escape would be harder, more complicated. But this felt too simple, too easy. He looked at Zura, trying to read her expression, but she was already moving toward the console, her fingers dancing across the surface. "What's going to happen now?" Ethan asked, his voice shaky with uncertainty. He didn't know if he was ready for whatever was next. "What are you doing?" Zura didn't answer right away. She pressed a few more buttons, her eyes flicking between the console and Ethan. Then finally she looked up at him, her expression somber. "I'm sending a signal," she said. "It's a distress call, a message to the outside. The transport ship will be here soon, but we need to be quick." Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. He didn't fully understand what Zura was doing, but he could tell that whatever it was dangerous. If she was sending out a distress signal, it meant someone important, would be coming to help them. But who would that be, and how would they help? Before he could ask any more questions, there was a sudden noise, a loud crash from behind them. the sound of metal slamming against metal. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the entrance, his breath catching in his throat. "They found us," Zura muttered under her breath, her eyes wide with panic. She quickly turned back to the console, her fingers flying across the controls, but the noise was growing louder. The walls seemed to shake with each impact, and Ethan could hear shouting now, alien voices calling to one another. Zura cursed under her breath. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "Get in the seat. I'll activate the emergency transport system." Ethan hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure what Zura had planned, but he knew there was no time to waste. If they didn't act fast, they would be caught. He moved quickly toward the seat, his body still aching from the injury, but the adrenaline was pushing him forward. The door to the room was starting to bend under the pressure of the aliens trying to get in. "Go!" Zura shouted, her eyes wide with fear. Ethan didn't wait. He sat down in the seat, strapping himself in just as the door finally gave way with a loud crack. The aliens were on the other side, and they weren't about to let them escape easily. But Zura was already moving toward the controls, her fingers pressing a sequence of buttons with speed and precision. The room around them began to hum with power. The walls vibrated as the emergency transport system powered up. Ethan could feel the energy coursing through the room, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from deep within the structure itself. He could hear the sound of footsteps growing louder, closer. "Now," Zura shouted. With a final push of a button, the room around them seemed to vanish. The walls, the noise, the danger, they all disappeared in an instant, replaced by a feeling of weightlessness. Ethan felt the rush of air as the transport system activated, pulling them into the unknown. The last thing he saw before everything went black was Zura's face, her eyes locked on him, her expression one of determination. She had done it. They were leaving. And they were headed somewhere far away from the aliens who wanted to control him. But where would they go next? What dangers awaited them? Ethan didn't know. But for now, all he could do was hold on. Ethan's mind was spinning, and his body still ached. But the moment they were sucked into the emergency transport system, everything seemed to change. 1 second, they were in that small, dimly lit room surrounded by the oppressive walls of the alien facility. And the next, everything was dark. The air around him was thick with tension, and he could feel the rush of energy surging through the transport system, pulling him faster and faster into an unknown place. The sudden shift left him disoriented. His stomach flipped, and he felt a wave of nausea hit him, but he forced himself to focus on Zura. She was sitting next to him, her face calm but intense. Her violet eyes were locked on the control panel in front of her, and her hands moved quickly across the buttons. Ethan tried to catch his breath, his chest still tight from the injury, but there was no time to waste. They were running from something, and he didn't know where they were going, but the escape was their only chance. He glanced around. The transport room was smaller than he expected, just enough space for the two of them. The walls were smooth, metallic, and had strange patterns pulsing in the dim light. The feeling of weightlessness was unsettling. Everything felt unnatural, like being suspended in space itself, yet there was no actual sensation of floating. The air was cool, and there was no sound, except for the hum of the transport system working its way through whatever unknown network they were traveling. The discomfort of the moment was compounded by the questions racing through Ethan's mind. Who were the aliens chasing them? What did they want with him? Why was Zura willing to risk so much to help him? She had mentioned something about a council, but he didn't understand what that meant. All he knew was that the longer he stayed in the dark, the more dangerous things would become. Zura, still focused on the console, didn't seem to notice his discomfort. Her fingers moved fluidly across the controls, and her expression was one of intense concentration. Ethan wanted to ask her about everything, about the strange trait in his chest, about what she had said before, but he knew this wasn't the time. He had to trust that she would explain when the moment was right. After what felt like an eternity, the transport system gave a soft, high-pitched hum, and the walls around them seemed to shift. The smooth, metallic surface of the room flickered for a moment before returning to its usual state. The rush of speed slowed, and the feeling of weightlessness faded. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but his sense of disorientation didn't fade. Zura finally turned to him, her expression a little softer now, though still tense. "We've reached our destination," she said quietly, her voice just above a whisper. "It's not safe here for long, but we need to get out quickly." Ethan looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. He couldn't see much. Everything around them was cloaked in shadow, and he couldn't make out the landscape beyond the transport room. His eyes darted to Zura, who was already unstrapping herself from the seat and moving toward the door. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the outside as she stepped out first. Ethan hesitated for just a moment before following her, stepping cautiously out of the transport room and into a vast, open area. The air was different here. It was thick with moisture, but the temperature was warm, almost humid. The ground beneath his feet was soft, as if he were standing on thick grass or some kind of plant. But what really struck him was the sky. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The colors were unnatural, streaked with shades of purple and blue, with swirling clouds that seemed to glow faintly. The landscape stretched out before him in every direction, with towering structures made of organic material, smooth, almost living-looking walls that curved and shifted, like they were part of the planet itself. The trees around them were enormous, their leaves glowing faintly in the light. The whole environment was alien, beautiful, and unsettling at the same time. Zura was already moving forward, her steps quick and purposeful. Ethan followed, still trying to take in the strange world around him. They didn't speak as they walked. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of the escape. He could feel the tension in the air, a sense of being pursued. He didn't know who, but he had no doubt that the aliens from the facility weren't far behind. Zura led him to a small, hidden alcove in the side of one of the large trees. It was barely noticeable, a small opening covered by thick vines and leaves. She pressed a hidden button on the side, and the entrance slid open, revealing a small, almost cramped space inside. There was just enough room for the two of them to stand. "Stay here," Zura instructed. "I need to make sure we aren't being followed." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to be left alone, but he knew that Zura had to do this. She had been the only one to show him any kindness, and now he had to trust her. He had no choice. She left the alcove quickly, disappearing into the foliage, her movements swift and almost soundless. Ethan was left alone, the heavy silence around him pressing in on all sides. He could hear the rustling of leaves above him, the soft breeze through the trees, but there was no other sound. He tried to calm his racing thoughts, focusing on his breathing. He didn't know how much time had passed, but it felt like an eternity. His body was sore, and his mind was still reeling from everything that had happened since he arrived on this strange planet. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. His chest ached with every breath, and every moment felt like it might be his last. He had no idea where he was or what Zura was doing, but he knew that this place, this planet, was dangerous. Whoever was after him, they weren't going to stop until they had him. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Zura returned. Her face was set, her eyes scanning the surroundings as she approached the alcove. She didn't speak immediately but motioned for Ethan to follow her. "We're safe for now," she said quietly, "but we need to keep moving." Ethan followed her again, stepping carefully through the dense foliage. He still didn't understand what was happening, but he couldn't let himself stop now. He had to survive. He had to find out what was inside him, what made him different from the rest of humanity. Zura led him deeper into the forest, her pace steady but quick. The strange glow of the plants and the shifting trees made everything feel like a dream, like they were walking through some kind of alien world that wasn't real. Ethan tried to make sense of it, but he couldn't. It was like he had stepped into another dimension entirely, one where everything was different. As they moved deeper, Zura finally spoke again. "You're not safe here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need to understand what's happening. The council is looking for you, and they'll stop at nothing to get you." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The council again. Who were they? What did they want with him? Zura paused, her gaze falling to the ground as she tried to collect her thoughts. "You're not just a human, Ethan. There's something inside you, something the council is desperate to understand. They want to study you, control you, but I can't let that happen." He looked at her, his confusion deepening. "What do you mean, what's inside me?" Zura's eyes met his, her gaze filled with a mix of fear and determination. "It's something no human should have. It's not just biological, it's something else. Something they've been searching for, something they've been afraid of." Ethan's mind raced. He didn't know what she meant, but he could feel the weight of her words settling in. Whatever was inside him, whatever had caused all this trouble, was more than just an injury. It was a key to something much bigger. And if the council got their hands on it, everything would change. Zura turned away, her voice low as she spoke again. We need to find a way to stop them before they realize what's really inside you. Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let anyone control him. Not now, not ever.